So hello everybody, welcome back to the show. So who can we really believe about what's going on in the world here? Can we believe USA or can we believe China? You know, it's so hard to tell what's going on because it's just a roller coaster of news. And so I'm going to dive into it a little bit there about the USA and China economic rivalry. And I'm going to start off with a little history about USA and China. And then I'm going to dig into some current events, two superpowers that really got me going this weekend here. And then I'm going to bring in a couple other things here in the end there. And I'm going to tie it all together. So I hope you stick around to the end and let's see where this goes. Okay. Hello everybody, welcome back to the show. Today I want to talk to you about the USA and China economic rivalry. I'll start off with a little history about the USA and China. Then I want to move on to a few current events between the two superpowers. It might be a little long-winded and I might bounce around a little bit, but I think it's all going to get connected in the end and make some sense. And I really hope you stick around to the end and I hope you enjoy it. So let's get going. So where do we start? England, or United Kingdom, had hegemony over the world from approximately 1815 to 1914. And then after that, no single power held global hegemony between 1914 and 1945. It was a period of shifting power dynamics between the decline of the British dominance and the rise of the United States. And in 1945, after World War II, USA gained hegemony with their economic and military might. And I believe it all came quite innocently, but true, nobody could touch the USA back then, and the USA held the world by its tail. They were the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world. And the USA citizens had every right to feel proud of who they were and what they became. But since World War II, USA has been involved in numerous conflicts, military conflicts, but there's no single agreed upon number due to the differing definitions of what constitutes a war versus intervention or operation. Major conflicts that the USA has been involved in are the Korean, Vietnam, Gulf, Afghanistan, and the Iraq wars, along with many other military operations. Some sources cite that the U.S. has engaged in over 200 armed conflicts since 1945, while other reports focus on different types of interventions with congressional report listings, 251 military interventions between 1991 and 2022 alone. But since then, there's also the Russian-Ukrainian war. That's a conflict that began in February 2014, and many Americans naively believe that the Ukraine war began in February 24, 2022. When Vladimir Putin invaded the country. It didn't, in fact. Fighting in Ukraine goes back nearly a decade earlier to February 2014. That's when the Ukrainian president, Viktor Yanukovych, was forced to flee his own capital in Kiev following a successful coup. The coup was no accident. Yanukovych was democratically elected, but he was friendlier with Putin than he was to the West. He was okay with Ukraine remaining neutral instead of joining NATO. So this put Yanukovych in the crosshairs of U.S. politicians and bureaucrats, including Victoria Nuland. And she's a U.S. diplomat, a lifetime employee of the U.S. State Department, who became an open supporter of regime change in Ukraine, going out so far as orchestrating protests and handing out cookies to agitators in the streets of Ukraine. Nuland didn't stop there at toppling Yanukovych, however. She even helped handpick his successor. So, discovered in a leaked phone conversation, she talked about the overthrow and the choosing of their next leader, out of which there were 3 candidates. She wanted and chose Yatsenyuk, and kept the other 2 candidates on the outside. U.S. media gushed about the bloodless coup in Ukraine. Today we know the coup wasn't bloodless at all. Ukraine became a battleground for the Cold War too. The U.S. government began arming Ukraine to the hilt and setting up CIA bases throughout the country, waging a political warfare against Russia from its own doorstep. Tensions boiled until they erupted in February 24, 2022. That's when Putin invaded Ukraine. Today, hundreds and thousands of dead are as a result. Putin warned and tried to negotiate to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO, but the USA has kept on pushing and insisting that Ukraine should be part of NATO, and in turn, USA would be able to put military bases along the Ukraine-Russian border. So, did Victoria Nuland and the CIA and others in the USA government who can't resist doing what the agency has always done, meddling in other countries' democratic elections, trying to cement and advance their own power and interest? Well, I think that's quite obvious. So yes, that's what they do. So that they're trying to, gain power in places where they got no business of being. So I think the Americans are still blind to the role its own government played in the war in Ukraine that escalated into a full-scale war. The principal demand of Russia has always been to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO. So now we can't forget about the unwavering, limitless support that USA has given Israel that continues to this day over Gaza and the atrocities that have been happening there. And I got to stop there because I'll probably go too far and cross the line that'll get me in trouble with YouTube. There's lots of things you can and cannot say, so I better just stop right there. So, okay, so now let's move on to China. For much of its history, China was the dominant civilization with global influence. But this ended with the century of humiliation from 1839 to October 1949, when the CCP came into power, marked by defeats and unequal treaties with Western powers and Japan. And after a period, China experienced a peaceful rise to power, beginning in the late 1970s with economic reforms that lifted it from poverty with significant improvements in their health, education, and other services that transformed it into a major global economic force that it is today. The term China was the world's factory became prominent in the early 2000s, significantly following China's joining to the World Trade Organization in 2001, which boosted its manufacturing exports. The USA led China's entry into the WTO to promote peace and reform, stating, "Today the House of Representatives have taken a historic step towards continuing prosperity in America, reform in China, and peace in the world. And that's where the USA helped China get into the WTO back in 2001. But since then, China has never turned back. China's a peaceful rise is remarkable, unmatched, and unforgettable. So it's something nobody else has been able to do. So let's move on to some current news that really fired me up, that made me want to make this video. On October 15th, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and Trade Representative Jameson Greer held a press conference. Greer started off by saying many are suggesting that China's action is simply posturing for leverage and negotiations with the United States. While that may be one element of China's approach, it is obvious that these controls are part of a broader plan by China to control the world's supply chain. These controls are widely out of proportion to target any actions by the United States and our allies over the past few months. China suggested that the United States has violated a non-existent agreement with the Chinese regarding export controls and implementation of measures. This is a false narrative deployed to justify these broad, unacceptable Chinese actions. There, in fact, is a published agreement between the United States and China from earlier this year. That is, the USA and China would suspend tariffs over 100% on each other. China further agreed to effectively suspend elements of rare earth control regime by expediting and approving licenses for US companies seeking rare earths. Both countries agreed to pause on tariffs and rare earth measures for 90 days while we pursue further negotiations, which have gone on quite successfully for the past 6 months. And there is a published agreement on this official US government and Chinese websites. It is the Geneva Agreement. It is not a secret, it's published. We kept our tariff flow, they kept the rare earth flow. We have not imposed reciprocal tariffs on Chinese since that time, but now the Chinese have expanded their rare earth controls and we have complied. They have not. And so in this context, this shows how China has announced its new and extremely expensive controls on rare earths just last week. Everything we've been working for the last 6 months, which was a stable tariff situation and continued flow of rare earth. The short story is that the USA has had compliance and the Chinese have not. The Chinese have escalated and they have taken this opportunity to accuse the USA of non-compliance to justify this, and the United States won't stand for this. So that was Greer's statement. And then Bessent said, I'd like to make a few points on China. As the president said, we want to help China, not hurt it. If somehow the Chinese government want to slow down the global economy through disappointing actions and through economic corrosion, the Chinese economy will hurt the most. And make no mistake, this was China versus the world. They have put these unacceptable export controls on the entire world. China is a command control economy, and we and our allies will never be commanded or controlled. They are a state economy, and we are not going to let a group of bureaucrats in Beijing try to manage the global supply chain. If China wants to be an unreliable partner to the world, then the world will have to decouple. The world does not want to decouple. We want to de-risk, but we should work together to de-risk and diversify our supply chains away from China as quickly as possible. Yeah, pretty helpful. Later, Besant said in his speech that Ukrainian government is going to produce photos of Chinese parts comprised a substantial amount in Ukraine drones. And it made me like, really? I had to rewind that part a couple of times just to make sure I heard exactly what it said. So does that mean that China is helping Ukraine? I'm not sure. But then he goes on to say, President Trump is a leader of peace. Chinese highly provocative moves come after we made significant efforts to de-escalate tensions. While there are substantial actions we could take, we would rather not. I believe China is open to discussion. I am optimistic and that this can be de-escalated. Ultimately, we are confident relationships between President Trump and President Xi. We have substantial communication with the Chinese over the past few days, and we believe there will be more forthcoming this week. So now what I understand from this press conference and from these two Trump puppets is that the USA has done nothing wrong. It's all China's fault. The USA's good, China's bad, as usual. So, that's the story that we always get. But on the next day, October 16th, the Chinese released their news conference highlighting China condemns Trump's new export controls. So this is what they say. Beijing wakes up to another headline that deepens the chill between the two largest economies. The Minister of Commerce spokesman accuses Washington of inflicting profoundly detrimental damage to the trade relations. In late September, United States introduced a so-called penetration rule for its export control entity list, extending to thousands of Chinese enterprises. Disregarding China's sincerity and consultations, the U.S. pressed ahead with new port fees on Chinese-built ships starting on October 1st. These moves have caused severe damage to China's interest, generating negative repercussions and have a profound detrimental impact. Yet another escalation in a trade feud that refuses to fade, that began years ago but now stretches into new unexpected sectors, that began the dispute over semiconductors, now has spread to the sea. Literally, the U.S. Section 301 investigation into China's shipbuilding industry has triggered new fees on vessels entering American ports. Officials in Washington call it a move to restore fair competition. Beijing calls it an economic coercion. Across China's shipyards in Shanghai, Dalian, Guangzhou, the reaction has been immediate. Shipbuilders warn that these tariffs could cost billions in lost contracts. Analysts say the measure could reshape maritime logistics, and ship owners reconsider whether to use Chinese yards for building or maintenance. For Beijing, it's not about the ships. It's about sovereignty and technological dignity. These last exchanges underscore the broader struggle over who will define the rules of the 21st century trade under President Donald Trump's second term. Washington has reasserted economic nationalism as a strategic tool. Tariff controls and penalties are back, not as a negotiating tack, but as pillars of policy. Trump insists they are necessary to protect American workers and counter unfair competition. His critics call them self-defeating, warning they could fracture supply chains and alienate allies. For China, however, the impacts go deeper than economics. Officials argue the United States is attempting to stifle the nation's rise, targeting sectors where China has made rapid progress: shipbuilding, artificial intelligence, and green technology. Beijing views these restrictions amount to containment, a deliberate effort to slow competitors' ascent. Over the past month, tensions have accelerated. In July, Washington expanded the list, restricting sales of critical components to more than 600 Chinese companies, from drone manufacturers to AI chip designers. Then came September's penetration rule, a technical revision, but one that vastly widens the net. The rule means that any product with USA technology, even assembled across, could fall under America's jurisdiction. For Chinese, it's a regulatory labyrinth. For U.S. exporters, it's a new layer of compliance, complexity, and for global investors, it's another reason to think risk. In Beijing, economic officials describe this environment as a fog of uncertainty. Foreign companies now find themselves caught in between compliance and competitiveness. Meanwhile, Chinese exporters face tighter margins and longer delivery delays. But despite the rhetoric, both nations still remain deeply intertwined. In 2024, bilateral trade still exceeded $650 billion. Every smartphone assembled in Shenzhen carries a component from Silicon Valley. Decoupling analysts say that it's easier to announce them to achieve corridors of power. The language of hearkening Trump's trade representative says the new fees and controls are a part of strategic alignment, a rebalancing meant to correct decades of exploitation. Chinese officials counter that this is unilateralism dressed as reform. One senior policymaker speaking for local medias compared the building a wall across the ocean. Behind the scenes, diplomats have been trying to keep communications alive. Meetings in Geneva, Bangkok, Singapore have all sought to reset the tone. None have been successful. Accuse the other of acting in bad faith. Beijing's offered transparency and cooperation. Washington says China pledges are empty for Chinese citizens. Chinese government has launched a new initiative called the Resilient Trade Plan 2025, aimed at reducing dependence on U.S. technology. It includes subsidies for domestic chip design, incentives for alternatives, ship propulsion technologies, and expand ties with emerging markets in Southeast Asia and Africa. In effect, Washington's pressure may accelerate China's push for technological independence, a paradox many economists note with irony. Across the Pacific, American exporters, they're also feeling the sting. Machinery makers in Iowa, agricultural traders in Kansas, and software firms in California now face new licensing barriers and declining. Across the Pacific, American exporters are also feeling the sting. Machinery makers in Ohio, agriculture traders in Kansas, and software firms in California now face licensing barriers and declining Chinese orders. Even the U.S. shipping companies fear that Beijing could retaliate with higher docking fees or port restrictions on American vessels. Trade officials privately admit that the escalation could hit U.S. consumers too, with higher prices on electronics, shipping costs, and even food imports. Economists warn that cycle of tariffs and counter tariffs could push global inflation upward again. Just as markets were stabilizing after years of pandemic and war-related disruptions, in Washington, however, the message remains defiant. Trump has repeatedly framed the issue as a test of strength. America must lead, not follow, he said. In a recent rally, our competitors will learn that the age of cheating is over. His words draw applause at home, but condemnation from abroad. In Beijing, the response is measured but firm. Officials say they will defend the nation's interests through lawful countermeasures. Already the Chinese Ministry of Commerce is reviewing potential restrictions on rare earth exports, a resource critical for global electronics and defense industries. Such move will mirror the escalation of 2019 when China temporarily delayed shipments to pressure Washington. This time, however, the stakes are higher. Rare earths are the lifeblood of the green transition from electronic vehicles, wind turbines. A disruption in the supply could ripple across Europe and the United States. The irony, analysts note, is that both sides claim to be protecting the future industries while undermining the stabilities of those industries depend on. So, inside China University, trade students are now studying not just economics, but geopolitics. Professors explain how tariffs have become instruments of foreign policy, not mere financial tools. They remind students that they have locked horns over commerce from the oil embargo in 1970 to Japan's export duties in the 80s. History is full of precedents, but none have been globally consequential as the current one. The world supply chain, once optimized for efficiency, we are now being rewired for resilience. Companies are diversifying production to Vietnam, India, and Mexico. Some call it de-risking, others call it decoupling. By the way, the map of globalization is being redrawn amid this economic chess game. Political signaling continues. Financial markets have taken note. The yen has slipped slightly again against the dollar, reflecting investor uncertainty. USA manufacturer stocks have also fluctuated as supply chain fears resurface. Yet behind the volatility lies deeper concern that what was once a trade dispute is becoming an enduring geopolitical divide. The World Trade Organization has found itself increasingly sidelines. Attempts by Geneva officials to mediate have stalled. Trump's administration officials argue that the WTO rules are outdated and biased. Beijing says Washington is dismantling the very system they once helped build. As these arguments unfold, business leaders are recalibrating. Some multinational CEOs advocating pragmatic approach, trade where you can, hedge where you must. Others warn the fragmentation of global commerce could cost the world trillions over the next decade. Still, the political callous is clear from Trump. Tough on China, rhetoric plays well domestically. For Beijing, standing firm against U.S. pressure bolsters national pride. Neither side wants to appear weak. Both sides believe time favors them. The European Union is caught between the two trading partners, urging restraint. EU Commissioner recently stated a stable global trading order benefits all, while hinting that Europe could seek a greater role in mediation. But within the bloc there is divisions. France lies towards protecting its industries. Germany favors engagement with Beijing, and small states like Denmark and Netherlands quietly worry about losing markets. Back in Beijing, the official line remains steady. The government insists it has ample policy tools to save its economy. At the same time, officials emphasize Chinese commitment to multilateralism, signaling that despite the friction, it still sees cooperation as a long-term path. Dialogue must be based on respect, not on pressure or punishment. For analysts, it was both a warning and an invitation. Beijing saying, talk to us, but don't try to dictate terms. Headlines across China media reinforce the message. China opposes unilateralism. USA measures harm global trade. For the rest of the world, however, collateral impact is mounting. Ports from Singapore to Rotterdam brace for shifting shipping patterns. Developing economies that rely on Chinese shipbuilding worry about cost increase. Meanwhile, investors question whether the global trade system can endure another round of confrontation. As both giants stare each other down, their fates remain entangled. Neither can easily isolate one from the other. The world's factories, markets, and supply routes depend on that uneasy interdependence, and that reality lies in the paradox of modern power. Strength defined not by separation, but by connection. And in the end, today's statement from Beijing is not just a diplomatic protest, it's a signal to the world that trade has become a new front line of global politics, from semiconductors to shipyards, from tariffs to support fees. The contest for control continues to reshape economics, alliances, and ambitions. The question is not whether the United States and China will compete, but it's how the world will navigate the space between them, particularly in late September when the U.S. introduced the penetration rule for its export control. Entity list effectively extend the list to encompass thousands of Chinese enterprises, simultaneously disregarding Chinese sincere and consultations. The U.S. insists on implementing the port fee measure under the Section 301 investigation into Chinese shipbuilding on October 1st. This caused severe damage to China's interest, generating negative repercussions that have a profoundly detrimental impact. Wow, I know that was a little bit long-winded, but I think it was very insightful to how the Chinese government feels. It's being betrayed by the U.S. once again, trying to control, contain, and slow down China's peaceful rise. You don't see President Xi on the news accusing the USA of wrongdoing. China is quietly implementing policies to protect themselves. Jeffrey Sachs, who I have been listening to for many years now, is a USA professor of economics. He has worked with many governments around the world, and I think he really knows from all of his experience with these countries. He's not just guessing, he's been there, and I respect what he has to say. He's been going to China since 1981, so I believe he's seen how China is coming out of its lowest point and opening up to the world since 1978. He says for the past 20 to 25 years, China's rise economically would eventually cause friction between the US and China. I've heard him say that many times. China's not a threat to USA military, it's only a threat economically. And it's only came in about the last 10 to 15 years since China has become more powerful, catching up to the USA economically. Before then, the USA just considered China their way of getting cheaper products into their country that they could sell at an extreme profit because the cost was so low and their profits were high. But like I said, China was never considered to be an enemy or a threat to the USA until recently. But by doing this, USA has also let its manufacturing sector only concentrate on the higher end commodities and let China produce the lower end commodities because of the labor costs were too much in USA. And that's how it all got started. China got their foot in the door and they just started making better and better quality lower end products and then eventually higher end products. Today, China is one of the highest technologically advanced producers of quality manufacturing in the world. And like I've always said to people that know me and around me, you learn by doing, and that's exactly what China did. I believe that the rise of China is good for the world. They are the largest trading partner to over 120 countries in the world. Okay, now let's talk about China's military buildup. It's for security. It's not for influence. China being one of the biggest countries in the world with one of the biggest technological advanced populations and economies, they didn't have the best military in the past that didn't serve them well. It only makes sense that they now today have one of the best armies in the world. Some would say it's equal to the United States. And why did they do this? It's mainly to defend themselves from anybody trying to stop their peaceful rise, mainly USA. Victor Gao, who is a Chinese American educated at Yale University. He's a lawyer that lives in Beijing. So both Victor Gao and Jeffrey Sachs believe that big powers in the world like USA, China, Russia, and India need to respect each other. And nuclear power countries cannot go to war without mutual destruction. If China can blow up the world 1,000 times, but China can only blow it up 100 times, there is no difference. At that point, there is no difference. So now, the reason I brought up Victor Gao is he said in one of his videos that you can fire the first shot at China, but you'll never be able to fire the second shot. China has the capabilities of protecting itself, and you will be destroyed if you're trying to destroy China. Jeffrey's argument is that countries need to stay out of each other's neighborhood. Like back in 1962, when USA tried to arm Turkey against the Soviet Union, then in turn the Soviet Union tried to arm Cuba against USA. That didn't work out very well, and that was the Cuban Missile Crisis. The USA does not want Russia or China to set up military bases in Canada, Mexico, or Cuba as an example. So why the hell would Russia want USA and NATO to go to Ukraine? Why would China want USA to intervene in Taiwan's reunification? Back in 1933, US President Franklin Roosevelt introduced a good neighbor policy. What is that? Well, it states that you should not intervene in other countries' internal affairs or try to overthrow them and change their government. Stay out of each other's neighborhood with your militaries. That's what the U.S. government wants. They would never allow anyone to intervene in their country. So what's good enough for the USA should also apply to the other 194 countries in the world. So why was it that it was all right for the USA to try to put NATO and USA military in Ukraine, that's Russia's neighbor, leave them alone? Why is it all right for the USA to put military bases in South Korea, Philippines, Japan's, arming Taiwan to the teeth? These are China's neighbors. China has 14 land borders and 6 sea borders with countries not including Taiwan, because Taiwan's part of China, and a lot of countries recognize a one China policy. Taiwan is a province of China. So the USA is using Taiwan, trying to provoke another proxy war with China like they did with the Ukraine. It's despicable. It's about trying to maintain USA's strategic hegemony in Asia. This is a country which has no land in the metropolitan zone of Asia. There's no part of it. There's no Alaska, there's no islands, there's no USA in Asia. It's 10,000 kilometers across the Pacific to the coast of California, but they claim and wish to be the primary strategic power in Asia. They should stay at home in their own neighborhood and leave Asia to Asia. China has committed, in the eyes of the United States, the greatest sin of internationalism. And what is that sin? It's to develop an economy as big or bigger than the United States. That's the sin. They got as big as USA. Americans would never condone or accept the state as large as they are. That's what China represents. They would have preferred that China remain in poverty, 20% of humanity forever. But the fact is now that an industrial, economically larger than the USA, this is about the maintenance of USA strategic hegemony in Asia. John Mearsheimer is somebody that I've heard in many interviews before. He's always advocated that we must control China. We must stop China. China is the biggest threat to the USA. I've heard this guy talk a few times and I'm not his biggest fan, but you can't ignore the protectionist, the alarmist, the naysayers that believe that the USA must stay in control of China and the rest of the world forever, never relinquish its crown. Now, John believes that in a world where there is a lot of uncertainty and changes are taking place all the time, states have a very powerful incentive to gain advantage wherever they can, to get yourself in excellent shape for a rainy day. When things go south in a few years, who knows, but you want to make sure that when things do go south, you're in good shape, stepping on and taking whoever and whatever they can is the best way to do this, and to take advantage of the other side. And if you could take advantage of the other side in its own neighborhood, you'll do it. Unfortunately, this is John's perspective, and I also think it's the way USA is thinking. Take it where you can and at any cost. I wish that all countries and people, for that matter, would try living by the golden rule. And what does that really mean? Treating others with the same kindness, respect, and fairness you would like to receive. Wouldn't the world be a better place if we all practice that? And I think that's almost the way the Chinese society lives. They want to live in a peaceful society. China got to where it is today without invading any countries. And with the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, trying to help other countries grow economically, making a better life for their citizens like all countries should try to do. I think so anyway. you know, USA is always throwing stones and that never expects anybody to throw a stone back, and we're number one, and they never want to let that go. So that's what got to me there. Like, you know, oh, why is China doing this? And then China turns around and says, well, this is what the USA are doing. We're just protecting ourselves. So anyway, that's it. I don't want to ramble on anymore. This is a long enough video. So catch you next time. Zai Jen. Bye for now.